The second thing that we will discuss regarding sectionalism are states' rights. Now, a lot of people say, and you'll hear a lot of people say, that states' rights is because of the Civil War, meaning that the federal government could not tell states what to do. They were violating the rights of the southern states. And that's simply not true unless you consider slavery a state right. And if you do, then okay, we can make that argument. But again, the cause of the Civil War is slavery. Every secession ordinance mentions it. Northerners and Southerners, people who lived in what we'll call the free states and the slave states, began to look at the United States differently. One followed regionalism and the other followed what we call nationalism. The North were nationalists. They adhered to the idea of nationalism, and that is that the needs of the state, the needs of the nation, the interest of the nation were more important than the needs of the state. Okay? And that's basically how we look at things today. We are a nationalistic society. The needs of the country, the interests of the country are more important than the needs or the interests of the state. People in the South, in those slave states, adhered to the idea of regionalism. The needs of the state or the needs of the region, the interest of the state, the interest of the state are more important than the interest of the nation. And so we had nationalism and regionalism. And let me give you an example of regionalism. Robert E. Lee. Everybody knows who Robert E. Lee is, right? You got that? Robert E. Lee? Okay. If you remember Lee's resolution, that was his uncle or father or somebody he was kin to. But Robert E. Lee was offered command of the United States Army just before the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln contacted Robert E. Lee, actually had him come to the White House and offered him command of the United States Army. After a couple of days, Lee turns him down. And his reason for turning him down was basically, I cannot raise arms against Virginia. I cannot fight against my state. Robert E. Lee considered himself a Virginian before he considered himself an American. And that was pretty normal. Even in the North, people were, well, I'm an Ohioan, or I'm from New Jersey, rather than I'm an American. Or I'm a Georgian, rather than an American. And that really doesn't change until after the Civil War has run its course. And you could see there were meetings of people that call themselves Southern rights men, all who are opposed to the rule of this government being placed in the hands of black Republicans. Now, what's a black Republican? There's one in this room, by the way. Abraham Lincoln was considered to be a black Republican. Abraham Lincoln his skin tone was not black. But yet he and most other Republicans were considered to be black Republicans because they took an anti-slavery stance. And so as you read stuff from 1860, 1861, you're going to see that term in many places. Slave states, once more, let me repeat that the only way of preserving our slave property, or what we prize more than life, our liberty, is by union with each other. Jefferson Davis, who would become the president of the Confederacy, calls to people, calls to men, calls to the states, let's unite, because that's the only way we can save what? Two things. One of them is preserve our what? Slave property. And as we look at the secession ordinances put out by those states that secede from the Union, you're going to see that phrase or something like it in every last one of them. We're doing this to preserve our way of life, to preserve slavery. All right, so I don't know. It's kind of weird. People were weird. So Southerners began to feel more and more like the North is using slavery and tariffs to control their way of life. In the 1800s, more and more factories are being built in the North because the North is an industrial region. They're making stuff, they're manufacturing things, and the South is not. So the South has to buy things like clothing, farm implements, anything that's manufactured, they have to buy either from the North or from Europe. And they like buying from Europe. The South likes buying from Europe because it's cheaper. And it was cheaper until the North began to use tariffs. What's a tariff? A tax on what? What kind of goods? Imports. Okay? And so with the tariff, European goods were no longer cheaper, they were more expensive. And so the South felt like they were being forced to buy goods from the North. And in a way, they were. You ready? All right. So tariff, let's just say American-made cloth and British-made cloth cost exactly the same. $4 a roll. That's fine. I can buy British-made cloth and I'm not losing any money, right? It costs me the same whether I buy it from Europe, from England, or whether I buy it from New Jersey. But Congress passes a 25% tariff on each bolt of cloth. So now instead of costing $4, it costs $5. Here's another way to look at it, another example, I guess. If you go to Germany and you buy a Mercedes Benz, okay, you're going to probably get a good price on it in Germany. But then you've got to have it paid, or you've got to pay for it to be shipped to the United States. And on top of the shipping cost, there's a tariff that's placed on that car. So a car that might cost you $60,000 suddenly costs you $100,000. Okay? You can go to a Mercedes-Benz dealership in America and buy the same car for $60,000. So, what would you do? I don't know about y'all, but I don't have an extra $40,000 laying around the house. Not that I know of, unless Miss Karen's been hiding it. No, I know her better than that. So the tariff is not something the South or the Democratic Party is in favor of. It is a thing that the Republican Party is in favor of. Why? Because it's what the North wants. And the Republican Party, at least at this point in time, is a totally Northern political party. All right. So, in 1828, Congress passes a tariff on cotton that the South thinks is ridiculous. In fact, they call it the Tariff of Abominations. What's an abomination? What? Something god awful. It is unbearable. It's something so terrible that you just can't live with it. You just can't put up with it. We're going to watch the best video ever made. Ever. I promise. Ever. You will go to bed tonight thinking about this video. Well, I tend to exaggerate, but I'm not exaggerating now. I'll go back. No, that's not it. I don't know what that is. Yeah, that's what it looks like. I hate anime. All right. Sorry, Luke, but we go. I'll even turn the lights out. Exactly. You should be. All right. So, the tariff of abominations, a tariff so high and so unfair, according to the South, that South Carolina actually threatens to secede because of it. And instead of seceding, they pass a law. South Carolina is the most radical of the southern states. And in fact, when um, William Sherman goes through South Carolina in early 1865, he destroys everything in his path. And I mean everything. And there's at least one of his officers that said, South Carolina started this thing, well, by God, we're going to end it. And they did. So South Carolina is very radical. They passed what is called the Ordinance of Nullification. And it declared that the 1828 tariff would not and could not apply to South Carolina. Stated that the federal government only existed because the states allowed it to exist. And if the federal government did something that the South or any state considered unconstitutional, it had the right to nullify that law within its borders. And so South Carolina basically says, we're not going to follow that law and you can't make us. John C. Calhoun, who's the vice president, who is also a South Carolinian, supports what South Carolina has done. He supports the Ordinance of Nullification. So now you have the Vice President of the United States saying that any state does not have to follow federal law. And one of the things you will learn as you read the Constitution, as you study the Constitution, is that federal law always takes precedence over state law. Federal law always takes precedence over state law. South Carolina says, and Andrew Johnson says, and orders South Carolina to change their law or risk invasion by the U.S. Army. And he himself says, I'll lead the Army. He's a general, fought in the War of 1812. And he said, he is so adamant about bringing South Carolina back into the fold. I will hang the first man of them I can get my hands on to the first tree I can find. Now, that's the President of the United States threatening to hang U.S. citizens. What happened on January 6th in 2021? Okay, the riot. Who do we think was responsible for that? Anybody with any sense thinks that a certain person was responsible for that. Who was it? President Trump. Okay? If he didn't start it, he didn't take the opportunity to end it like he should have. What's the difference between that and what Andrew Jackson threatens to do? Is there any difference? I don't think so. I think he should have been impeached, not only for that, but what he does to the American Indians. So he frightens South Carolina sufficiently enough. They withdraw their nullification law. Congress lowers the 1828 tariff with the tariff of 1832, but the damage has been done. North and South no longer trust one another. And the South in particular feels betrayed by the federal government, and Andrew Jackson in particular. He is a Southerner. He's from Tennessee. And yet, he does not support the South. That's how people looked at it. Except in Georgia. You know, we like everybody. Georgia still supported Andrew Jackson. All right. So, when we watched John Green the other day, he talked about resistance, right? And we talked a little bit about resistance. What did we say was the most effective means of resistance? 2 words. Start with F. Family and faith. Why? Because those 2 things tended to humanize rather than dehumanize. And so one of the people that he talked about was Nat Turner. And we'll talk about Nat Turner because his rebellion is the most successful that we have. August of 1831, Nat Turner, who's a preacher, which means what? He can read and write. Nat Turner organizes a rebellion. About 80 people end up joining his rebellion, and they travel from plantation to plantation, murdering the inhabitants of the plantation, the white inhabitants of the plantation, setting the enslaved persons free or asking them to join. Finally, the Virginia militia is called out. They stop Nat Turner and his crowd. They kill many of those when they encounter them, except for Nat Turner. Nat Turner is able to escape. And he's eventually caught and eventually hanged along with 16 other folks. I think I have a video. Do I have a video? Hey, I do. Look at there. Oh, stop it. Nobody care about you. All right. Not just dead. Huh. So, was Nat Turner successful? Yes and no. He was not successful in that he ends up losing his life, but he is successful in that he got people's attention. He did send a message. Now, he's also unsuccessful in that what happens to the slave population of Virginia after his rebellion? Are they treated better? No, they're treated worse. The laws become even more harsh. Preaching is made illegal. A black man, it was illegal for him to preach. And so a great part of their culture and their family and their community was taken away from them. So let's see if you can answer some questions. The North was becoming an economy based on what? Industry or slavery? Industry. The Southern economy was based on, you can actually argue two different answers. You could argue cotton or you can argue slavery, but you don't have one without the other. They're intertwined. A tax on an imported good is called a, the idea that a state can declare a federal law invalid is called nullification. The idea that the interests of the nation are most important is called nationalism. During the 1800s, the South's most important cash crop was cotton. The president who betrayed the South during the crisis of 1828 was Andrew Jackson. All right. So we talked a little bit the other day about the importance of compromises, and there are two compromises that we're going to talk about. We'll start today and finish tomorrow. And the first is called the Missouri Compromise. And it has to do with the West. Why is the West so important? Which way is America growing? West. And what do we do with all that land out west? Is it open to slavery or not? That's the big question. That's the burning question. So by 1820, the population of the North has grown so much that it now controls the House of Representatives. Why is that important? Is it important? And if so, why? How are laws made? Where are laws made? In Congress, which is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate. So the North controls the House of Representatives, which means that there will be no pro-slavery legislation coming out of the House of Representatives. There will be no pro-slavery legislation passed, period, because the North controls, the free states control the House of Representatives. And in order for a law to be made, it has to be introduced either in the House or the Senate. Y'all remember the Schoolhouse Rocks video? I'm just a bill, so I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Okay? You know, hopefully you know, that in order for a bill to become a law, it has to pass both houses of Congress. And let's just assume, okay, that there's a bill that Shire, as the representative for the 11th District of Georgia, introduces into Congress. She introduces it in the House of Representatives, and it's a pretty good bill. It basically says if a person is caught driving while using their phone, they will lose their license for a year. No, it should be, but it's not. Okay? She stands up, she reads that bill, Everybody gives her applause. Yes! Woo, you the woman! That bill is entered into the congressional record. It goes into a committee, and they read it, and they study it, and hey, this is a pretty good bill. So they approve it. They vote aye. Jude is the only one who votes nay because he's a knucklehead. And is it a law yet? No, it's got to go to the Senate, and it's read in the Senate. And then it goes through the same process. It's sent to a committee. The committee reads it. Maybe they change something. It goes to the Senate for vote. The Senate votes aye, but because they changed something, it's got to go back to the House, and the whole thing starts over again. They read it. They think, yeah, that's a pretty good change, so they vote yes. Now what happens? Goes to the president, and the president can do one of three things. He can sign it, which makes it a law. He can veto it, which means it's got to go back to the House. And if that happens, it's probably never going to become a law, or he can do nothing. And if he does nothing, after so many days, the bill automatically becomes a law. Yeah. It just does so without the president's signature. And it may be something he doesn't want his name on. Maybe something he doesn't totally agree with, but he realizes it's an important law. And if it's not an important or a good law, then somebody will fix it down the road. You get a ticket. Just torques my jaw to no end. I'll be riding down the road and there's Grandma over there on her phone. Just looking away. Blah, 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 blah. And it is illegal in the state of Georgia. So, all right. So we got our bill. It becomes a law. Okay? If I'm in the South, I'm a Southern representative, and I introduce a pro-slavery bill into the House of Representatives, what's going to happen to it? It's going to die. It's never going to leave the House. It's probably never going to leave committee. Okay? So the South knows they cannot do anything in the House. But the Senate is a different story. The Senate is equal. There's an equal number of representatives or senators from slave states and free states. So even though those slave states cannot get anything pushed through Congress, they can prevent things from being pushed through Congress. And they're pretty happy with that. They're okay with that. They don't have an equal representation in the House, but they do in the Senate. And because they do in the Senate, they can protect themselves a little bit. Okay? So everything's hunky-dory until it's not. This is what the United States looked like in 1819. The pink are states in the United States. The kind of darker pink are disputed areas. Okay? The gold are territories. They were all part of the Louisiana Purchase. And the gray belongs to somebody else, either Spain or Russia or Hawaii. Okay? So that's what it looked like in 1819. In 1820, Missouri applies for admission to the state, or to the United States. Yes. It became a U.S. territory in the late 1800s. It became a state in 1954, 55, somewhere in that time frame. We basically stole it. Yeah. So, Missouri applies for admission to the states, to the United States, and they want to come in as a slave state. The North is not going to allow that happen, because if they do, there will be one more slave state than free state. And so, they call in this guy, Henry Clay. We just heard about him in that wonderful video. He is a Southern senator from Kentucky. And he comes up with a compromise. comes up with a compromise that both sides can agree on. And really, from that time on, he is known as the Great Compromiser. Whenever there's a problem that needs a compromise, they're going to call on Henry Clay. And he does a pretty good job. Can you imagine the monumental task that he is given? You've got the interest of the slave states, cotton, slavery, and the interest of the free states, industry, manufacturing. And you got to balance it. Difficult job. Henry Clay does it. This is what happens. Missouri is admitted to the United States as a slave state. Maine is created from land that belonged to Massachusetts and is admitted as a free state. And Congress goes further and says that in the future, slavery would not be allowed north of the 3630 line of latitude. In other words, going this way. In the future, there will be no slavery north of that line. Everybody's happy. Until they're not. They're happy for about 30 years. So, pretty good compromise. They can live with it. So you've got Missouri, you've got Maine, and you've got the 3630 line of latitude. All right? Ready? See what happens. Here you go. Green, slave states. Yellow, free states and territory. Pink, where is it? Here's the 3630 line. So is this free or slave? Free. Arkansas, is it below or above the 3630 line? So it is open to slavery. We don't own this yet. We're not real sure about this. But we know we don't own that yet. That's Texas. Texas becomes an independent republic before they become a part of the United States. All right. So the compromise, the Missouri Compromise, works for a while until it doesn't. 1850, we again have controversy. The United States defeats Mexico in the Mexican-American War that ends in 1848. Well, here's the 3630 line right here. I don't know if you can see it or imagine it. And all this land becomes part of the United States. Under the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, is that land open to slavery or not? It's below the 3630 line, so it's open to slavery. And the North does not like that. Those free states don't like that. They don't want slavery spreading into that territory that was won from Mexico. And so they begin to make noise. Henry Clay is brought in, again, the great compromiser, and he comes up with a compromise. California will be admitted to the Union as a free state, but other lands would be open to slavery. So California. And if you look at the line, half of California is below the 3630 line. So California is admitted as a free state. The slave trade is abolished in Washington, D.C., not slavery. That doesn't happen until 1864. So the slave trade is abolished, and a very strict Fugitive Slave Act is passed. And this Slave Act punished people for not sending slaves back or for helping escape slaves, and it forced people to return them to their owner. All right, we'll stop right there.